This episode is about mastery. When we realize how far we are from our goals, what can we do about it? What is the main lever we can press to increase our skill in a certain area? And that is what is called deliberate practice. This was created by K. Anders Ericsson, and he found through studying people that were the top in their field that they did not just put in more hours. More hours does not always equal the same amount of improvement. He found through deliberate practice, which has criteria that we're going to get into, people improved tremendously. But just to paint this example a little bit clearer, I believe it was Greg McEwen and Tim Ferriss talking on a podcast episode where one of them said, do you have 20 years of experience or do you have 1 year of experience 20 times? So let's break down these areas of deliberate practice. The first one is breaking a skill down into a specific task. Meaning, you don't just think, I'm going to get better at photography today by taking a ton of pictures. You pick a specific area to improve. For instance, I am going to work on compositional framing by doing leading lines for the eyeline. That way, when I take a photo, there's a bit of a narrative arc of where the eyeline should follow. Anyway, I don't need to keep going. This isn't a photography podcast, and I'm reaching the limit of what I even know about that. But you picked a component, and this applies to any field. You break down your field into many components, and then you work on one at a time. It's too hard to say, did I get better at photography today? I don't know. The next one is immediate feedback. How did it go? And we'll go into all these a little bit deeper in a moment, but the next component is time for problem solving. What would make this better next time? And then finally, an opportunity to repeat and refine the behavior, trying out what you learned to see if things improved and keep refining. Now, this is a bit tricky without a teacher. Because if you did go out and take all those photos and you were looking for that immediate feedback, it might be a bit subjective. Are the photos you took today better than the ones you took a week ago? Now, there might be certain criteria you could use, sort of like a checklist to see if you improved certain areas. We'll get into methods of feedback later in the episode, both with or without a teacher. But there are certain skills that are a bit easier to see feedback on. For instance, if you're shooting free throws, practicing a certain technique, you will know immediately if the ball is going in with that technique. So it's not the same learning every type of skill. There's going to be some variation here. Another component of deliberate practice is being persistent and consistent to show up and work on your craft day after day for years. You might have heard of the famous 10,000 hours rule, popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in the book Outliers. Malcolm Gladwell actually studied the work of K. Anders Ericsson, this researcher who studied top performers and came up with this idea of deliberate practice. The nuanced, tricky part of this, though, is that I found through what I studied for this episode that Malcolm Gladwell did not actually talk to K. Anders Ericsson. And then this researcher had some critiques of Gladwell's work because in Outliers, it sounded as though as long as you put in 10,000 hours, no matter what, you would become successful. You could become the top in your field. But Ericsson said that, again, like we talked about, just putting in more and more hours does not guarantee you will be successful. And this is why he said it's about deliberate practice. It's about the kinds of hours you put in. And even then, there's no guarantee that you would be the top in your field necessarily. That 10,000 hours number was also just an average. Not every field required that exact amount. And I also think that Gladwell understands some of this nuance, particularly later as more came out. But he did even say in his book, for instance, even the year you were born could impact this. So there's a lot of nuance there, but I still think that the idea of 10,000 hours can be helpful because, as this one Redditor had said, I'll link it down below in the article, they basically said, look, who knows and who cares about the exact number? 10,000 hours is equal to about 3 hours a day for a decade. If you have average aptitude, elite level persistence, and a good system for training chess deliberately, you will almost certainly become extremely good at chess. It's a book with a catchy title and a bunch of cool stories and anecdotes, I assume, but it all boils down to spend a very long time deliberately improving a skill, and you will, you guessed it, improve at that skill. And I think that this is a really succinct way to get at the idea that we love clean answers. We love guarantees. Oh, if I do 10,000 hours, I will succeed at this. We do not want to bet on something that won't pan out. But the idea, if we take it at face value, that if you put in a lot of hours, specifically the right type of hours, deliberate practice, you will absolutely be better, especially if you do it over the long term. And so it's holding these two things, the idea that there's no guarantees about the exact level of success, but there is a guarantee that you will get a lot better than where you are now. And I think that's a bit exciting. And having that number in mind can be helpful in cases like my own. For instance, when it comes to this podcast, where I felt, hey, I should be getting pretty good at this. Why am I not that good at this yet? Instead of getting more and more frustrated, I can see, oh, yes, I am 1/20th of the way into this goal. Truly, if I were to think about it in terms of 10,000 hours, maybe I've put in 500. My results actually make a bit more sense now, and I don't have to be as frustrated. So it actually can be a heartening mindset, even though it might not sound like it at first. And so since deliberate practice is so effective, someone might be asking, well, then why isn't everyone doing it all the time? And that comes down to a few things. I mean, one, you might not have known about it. It's kind of a niche psychological area. So now that you know about it, you can apply it. But going past that, it is not easy. It is draining emotionally, cognitively, and physically. I equate it to being in the gym, and most people do not do side planks because they're hard. And they also don't do rotational exercises because they don't think about it. So then people have a weak point, their obliques, that gets weaker and weaker. And the weaker it gets, the less people want to train it. So it becomes a cycle. And I think we do that with our skills. We lean on what we're good at. We go on autopilot. We jump in the pool and just start swimming laps. We're not necessarily thinking, oh, let me work on my flip turns today and see if I'm a little faster. Now, that brings up the idea of, do we need to be applying deliberate practice to everything we do? Well, I think we need to be applying it to the areas we want to get better at. If you're just swimming for a teeny bit of cardio and you don't really care to get better, fine, maybe you don't work on your flip turns. But if there's an area that you want to improve at and you're not seeing the results you want, that's where you definitely want to apply deliberate practice. When I say that it's emotionally, cognitively, and physically painful, it would be physically painful more in the case of sports, but emotionally painful because sometimes we're getting feedback we don't want to get, either from ourselves, like I mentioned, listening back to a certain episode that I didn't want to listen to once I realized, oh, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. This isn't good. I just want to stop. Nope. You need to listen to it and analyze why didn't it work so you can improve next time. Or someone might not want to hear feedback from their boss or their coach about where they really stand and how they really can improve. It's painful sometimes, but it often gets worse before it gets better in regards to certain skills when we go for our weak points. Let's say that you're playing tennis and you can get it over the net if you hit it the way you've been hitting it. It might not be a by-the-book technique, but it works. If we try to work on deliberate practice and more follow-through, might not go over the net every time. You might be taking a step backwards in terms of result to take a step forward, but then you might decrease your risk of injury, improve your accuracy, and of course, many more benefits. But deliberate practice is asking over and over again, what can I improve? And as humans, we usually are trying to reduce the amount of effort that we have to do in some ways. That just makes sense evolutionarily to not try to create more work for ourselves. But that's why, now let's get into our shift section with some techniques. You want to apply it in short chunks. So in the beginning, maybe you sit down to do some writing in 30-minute chunks because that's the most focused you can be for that long. And then you might increase it to 60 minutes, 90 minutes. And then maybe you're doing 4 hours a day of writing, but you're having a couple breaks in that time. You're finding what works for you so that you can do these sprints of focused effort. In fact, that's a specific area within deliberate practice that Ericsson emphasizes, is doing short bursts so that you can be extremely focused, and not burn out and able to show up repeatedly. The next thing we can do is understand the difference between a closed skill, or what's called a kind learning environment, compared to an open skill and a less kind learning environment. So a closed skill is something like chess or golf. These are activities where the situation is very stable and there's less unknown factors. Getting good at golf is very different from getting good at soccer. Now, this is a metaphor. We can apply this to things that are not sports in a moment, but when you play soccer, there are many, many, many more situations you need to prepare for. Even though, of course, in golf, yes, the ball could be in a variety of places, but it is much more stable. Business is a less kind learning environment compared to something like chess. In a business meeting, there's so many different ways something could unfold. But what we can do is still work on improving one aspect at a time. So for instance, if we go back to the soccer example, someone might work on their penalty kicks. Or to go further, they might just work on dribbling or passing. And those are very specific skills they have control over. And then later they can apply it to less and less kind learning environments. So in business, you again could break down a very specific skill. Maybe you want to get better at speaking up in meetings. And maybe it's hard in meetings with 20 or more people, but you have a smaller meeting on Fridays with a team of only 5 people, and maybe you start adding your opinions or questions there first. So we're still, regardless of what we want to get better at, picking components, which brings us to a very, very practical thing you could apply, which is making sort of a menu of what are the different components of your field that you want to get better at. So if we go back to the photography example, maybe there was the leading lines we talked about, but maybe there's also the use of technological stuff such as aperture, and you would make a list of all of the different things you want to improve as a photographer. And it can be really broad, not just taking the photos. It might even be, I want to get better at the business side of my photography work. You might have listened to our episode from last week on flow. In flow, your skill matches the challenge. In deliberate practice, the challenge exceeds your current abilities. You're trying to stretch your abilities beyond where they're at. And that's why it's so uncomfortable. So when you're doing your practice, you're always asking, what is that weak point? And it doesn't even have to be particularly weak. You could have an area you're pretty good at and you want to get better. Again, you're stretching beyond. What I try to do now in these episodes is pick one thing to improve. And by the way, I'd love to hear from you in the comments, or if you write or call into the show, and hear more about what you're looking to improve and how you might apply deliberate practice to it. 3 more tips on applying deliberate practice to your life, and then we'll get into how mastery is related to happiness, because this is part 6 in our series on positive psychology. So I kind of got into this earlier, but seeing this as a heartening opportunity instead of discouragement. I know that can sound difficult in the throes of seeing how far we have to go, but I always tell clients that I would much rather know why something isn't working, because then we have a path to move forward. For instance, if they have knee pain and their quads and glutes are not firing well and they're extremely tight in surrounding areas, okay, great. We have a path. If everything's going perfectly and they're still having pain, then we'll of course have to loop in other professionals and see what's going on. So if you feel like you're not seeing the success you want in a certain area, you can grab deliberate practice like a life raft and realize this can help. It is an opportunity. It's not like a punishment to have to work harder in a certain area. It's a path forward. Another thing you can do is to try to bake it into your routine. In the flow episode from last week, I talked about how I could increase flow in my work by trying to make certain things more challenging where I'm getting bored or complacent. And in order to do that, though, I'm going to have to block off probably about 45 minutes a week where I try to update my programming to put in slightly more cognitively interesting exercises so I don't just keep falling back into the same patterns. Before a chunk of deep work, we can go into deep work another time, but you may have heard that term by Cal Newport. Before you sit down to really get into it, thinking, what am I going to work on this session? How am I going to evaluate my feedback? How am I going to apply deliberate practice? Even doing it requires a little bit of forethought, a little bit of planning, and setting aside some time. And it could even just be actually a couple minutes before you start a work session. In my case, my specific example required a bit more time because I can't just have exercises pop in my head. I'd have to sit down and do some research for it. So it might depend on the skill you're working on. And now the last thing we can do, and arguably the most important, is improving our feedback mechanisms. In his book, Mastery, Robert Greene dedicates a whole section to an apprenticeship phase. I believe, at least in certain parts of the world, like where I live, this apprenticeship phase has gone out of fashion. My hairstylist talked about being an apprentice for a while, and I'm a real fan of how she approaches her work. She really views it as this long process of continuous improvement, but she didn't expect to be successful right away. And we often try to skip past that, thinking we could just teach ourselves things. This doesn't always have to be something like going back to grad school, although it definitely can be, because that's going to give you teachers, it's going to give you chunks of time to focus on your craft. Coming in the edit, I actually heard Ericsson speak on a podcast, Good Life Project, and when he spoke about his research on deliberate practice, he actually really emphasized that that is through working with a teacher of some sort. If you're doing it on your own, he called this purposeful practice. But he made this distinction because teachers, mentors, people that have walked the path ahead of us cut down the learning curve so much that working with someone who's more experienced than you, that is deliberate practice. And it was just really fascinating hearing him emphasize that point so much. So as we keep going with some other ways you might do this on your own, that would fall more under the umbrella of purposeful practice. It can be peer feedback. It can be technological assistance. For instance, you might have a metronome telling you if you're keeping the cadence you want. There might be some software you could use for learning a language, but we might need outside feedback, and that feedback can come in many forms. It could just be trying to say something out loud to someone else, trying to teach someone else what you're learning, and then realizing, oh, I cannot explain this to a friend. I must not really understand it. I need to go back to the drawing boards for that gap in knowledge. And it might even be tracking your progress, writing it down, making notes. You know, we talked about that example of speaking up more in meetings. If you write down how it's going, what you applied, and if there was a certain thing that worked better, noting that, this is a way to track progress too. It can even just be writing it out and having data. Oh, and final bonus tip is trying to make the feedback as immediate as possible. So for instance, when my partner was studying in grad school, he got a app that does flashcards, and he found his scores improved with that compared to reading through his notes before tests. This was both active recall instead of passive. It also gave structure, but there was a very immediate, was it right or wrong? For instance, if you were trying to improve math, you wouldn't want to do 30 problems and then check which ones were right or wrong. You would want to do a problem, check the answer, troubleshoot from there. That's how we get in those really conscious reps. Okay, pivoting to part 2 of this episode, which is relating all of this back to positive psychology. We talked about in part 1 on our series on positive psychology, the tool PERMA Plus. And this is the acronym that has all of the different aspects we can think about when we want to increase our happiness. So we had flow state last week, was the E for engagement. We're going to talk about relationships, which is the R in PERMA. But this week, we're working on the A, which is achievement. And the reason why we talked so much about mastery and the process in this episode is, you probably guessed it, that achievement in positive psychology does not relate to getting some big award or necessarily making a ton of money past getting your needs met and maybe a little extra. It's about working on something that matters to us and the sense that we can go out and attain the things that matter to us, and the process One way to think about how achievement relates to positive psychology was put by Lynn Suits on an article on the Positive Psychology People. It's a website I found. She says, goals attained, whether large or small, feed into belief in one's internal motivation, efficacy, and even resilience. The second part of this is the conscious way we grab hold of the moment, and like a three-dimensional piece of art, we see it, we feel it, and we appreciate it. She was talking about learning surfing and how one time she was watching these surfers surf these pretty difficult waves, really expertly navigating it. And then another time, not long after, she was taking a surfing class and just felt so ecstatic to be able to stand up for a moment on the board in the water catching a small wave. And she goes on to describe how what led to happiness in her achievement story was clearly not having some huge achievement there. She might never be able to surf like those people. It came from not only non-comparison, taking the achievement for what it is versus how does that achievement stack up to other people's achievements, but also savoring it. I thought that was so beautiful. She said, and like a three-dimensional piece of art, we see it, we feel it, and we appreciate it. And she talked about the idea of relishing and the idea of savoring. I'm not particularly good at this. I think a lot of us, we achieve something and we're quickly moving on to the next thing. So the practice of sitting in where we are and how far we've come, that ties into the P of PERMA. That is positive emotion, positive feeling states. And in this series, we've been talking a lot about different tools we have. But one tool we have is to take in a moment, to lean into the positive feelings associated with it. And I think there's a person that does this so beautifully. It is a dancer named Indiana who was, maybe still is, the Sugar Plum Fairy in the Nutcracker in New York City. I'm going to link a video down below showcasing a typical day in her life. Speaking of masters of craft, of how much dancers dedicate to their craft is incredible. Her day sounds lovely, I think, but also grueling, and clearly almost everything connects to and feeds into her art. She still has some balance. She takes a slow morning reading a book in the morning with her dog. But the thing that stuck out to me was how much joy she found in her day-to-day, despite the amount of work. And she found a lot of joys in the achievements she already had. For instance, she really took in every morning walking to Lincoln Center, the gravity of that, and just the people that have come before her and how special it is to work there and perform at that place. That's something that she felt every single day. And I think that some achievements, probably the ones that don't apply as much in positive psychology, are the ones that are very fleeting or short term. Think about how happy you are after a promotion, but then that fades away. There are these quick bumps in happiness that then are fleeting. But the process of going to work every day at a place that you care about or feel good about, the process of showing up for yourself maybe and a skill you want to do, maybe the way you set up your desk where you sit down to work feels good to you and you savor that you get this time to get to work on this, can be something that can contribute to well-being. There's something about the mundanity of every day that, while it can be overlooked, it's the thing that's more enduring. The award comes and goes, but that special sacred space or routine or part of your life keeps going. And another aspect that's connected to continually showing up is who we become in the process. This is something that I can't attribute to one person in particular. It's something that I've seen over and over again. Some people even believe that we can almost refine ourselves or work towards enlightenment or self-actualization. One of the routes there can be through dedication to a craft or a calling. There are many routes. You could sit in silence for many hours, but another route is to dedicate yourself to a calling. Or as Nellie Bly, a journalist, said, you can pray through your work. And this is a woman who in the 1880s went undercover to what was then referred to as the Blackwell's Insane Asylum in New York. And she did a 10-day investigative piece exposing the situations there. And I believe she would do this in other areas as well. I would love to talk about her more on a deeper dive later, but she didn't try to separate, her ideal self, her values, integrity, or probably, in this case, her spirituality from her work. She integrated all of it, and that service, that contribution, who she became, how she was tied to other people in her community and made their lives better too, that was all connected to her work. And I think that's another way that achievement and mastery can be connected to well-being, and way more than simply the idea of achieving something. It can be connected to your life as a whole and your happiness, hence it being in positive psychology. And when we talk about achievement and mastery, this isn't about hustle culture. It's about alignment. Many people have heard of the deathbed cliche that no one ever looks back and wishes they spent more time at the office when they're looking back on their life. And while that's a great reminder to be present with our families, as students of positive psychology here, I think that can be a bit of an oversimplification. In this field, we know that achievement and mastery are core pillars of a flourishing life, hence this being the A in the PERMA model. So how does the type of work change the nature of regret or how we look back on our life? We can think of 3 different groupings here and the why behind the work. So one category is the workaholic or avoidance of life. This is the person who stays at the office as a shield to bolster their ego, to avoid the messy, vulnerable parts of life. And I think of the father in White Lotus in season 3. Of course, there's caveats I could go into there, but someone that has a hard time detaching from work. And for them, achievement is a hollow metric. Then there's another group. We could think of them as the provider, and their work is an act of devotion. This might be a person working multiple jobs or long hours for their family. They care about their family's safety and security. And look, I have to be honest, in a perfect world, no one should have to work themselves to exhaustion just to survive. But within that struggle, there's a sense of profound purpose. A parent rarely regrets the sacrifices that they're making for their children. They might just have qualms with the system that they're in that required it. And lastly, another group that might be working long hours is what we could call a builder or a craftsman. These are the creators, healers, and people that are often in flow or aiming to continually work on their craft and skill, like we've talked a lot about in this episode. And for them, work isn't the opposite of life, it's leaning into it. So no matter how your work contributes to the world, you won't regret it. It's an integral part of your flourishing. Happiness doesn't come from working less, and it doesn't come from blindly working more. It comes from ensuring that the energy we spend is actually building the life we want to live and the world we want to live in. A final takeaway here is over and over again in psychology, the idea of internal motivation, pursuing things for their own sake, pursuing things because they authentically matter to you, all of that greatly leads to happiness. Now, we can get into another time the complexities between what exactly is internal motivation, if there's an external reward, and how do we increase the amount of things we're doing for intrinsic reasons. All of that, it can actually get really complicated, which is why I love having this podcast, because there's more and more rabbit holes to go down and they shoot off of each other. So always let me know if you want follow-ups on certain topics that we had to brush over in certain episodes. But if you want an episode to listen to after this, there are a few that you could turn to. I have another episode on mastery and some frustration that people get at certain sticking points, particularly things I gleaned from the book Mastery by George Leonard. There are 2 books called Mastery. I referenced them both here, as you can tell, but that is a mini dive on that one. I can link that below. I also have an episode on perfectionism where I talk quite a bit about the idea of the dip coined by Seth Godin. So if you feel like you face perfectionism issues with improving, that could be a good follow-up. And then we also mentioned in this episode the grit and optimism episode if you'd rather focus on belief. So I will link all of those down below. Thank you to Boris for editing this and Miranda for producing the show. Oh, last announcement. We are probably going to change the artwork soon, so keep an eye out for that. If you're listening in a podcast player, it might look different in the next month. And speaking of trying to master skills, we will be releasing an episode every other week for the next 3 episodes so that we can improve our craft and our work on the show. The show is called Immersion, so I want to be diving even deeper into these topics, bringing in guests, reading more research, and that will only be possible if we're ahead in our production schedule and not working right up until the finish line before these go live. So taking 3 episodes, which will be 6 weeks to release every other week, will be really integral in helping with that. Thank you for being here. If you found this helpful, you could consider sharing it with a friend and talking about something that you found interesting from it with them this week. Maybe you can talk about what skills you're looking to apply deliberate practice to. I will speak with you next time, either in 1 to 2 weeks. Talk to you then.